Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and jumping into Essential X-Men Volume 7, today we're going to be focusing on X-Men Annual Number 10. This was written by Chris Claremont, and it was illustrated by Arthur Adams with inks by Terry Austin. So, this was the story wherein the character of Longshot was introduced to the team. So, Longshot actually made his first appearance in his own miniseries, and he was created by writer Ann Nocenti and artist Arthur Adams, aka Art Adams. And as he was introduced in his own miniseries, he was a fugitive from another dimension with a case of amnesia, and he ends up in our world, in our dimension, and as he goes on a series of bizarre adventures and makes the acquaintance of a random set of people and creatures, he comes to find that as his memory starts to come back to him over time, he comes to find that he was actually a genetically engineered being from a place called Mojo World, which is in a dimension called the Mojoverse. And he was actually a member of a slave race that performed in gladiatorial games for the entertainment of a race of creatures called the Spineless Ones. And the Spineless Ones were essentially monstrous couch potatoes, and they were led by an individual named Mojo, who is, much like his race, a monstrous couch potato, but with a calculatingly, evil mindset. And he was created to essentially be a dark satire of the media industry in general. And so, this slave race that he, had, a creature named Arise, create, the slave race, was basically made just to entertain the spineless ones. And during these gladiatorial games, there are oftentimes elements from popular movies and other dimensions that make their way into these games. But nonetheless, make no mistake, people were really dying during these games. And so Arise, the guy who created Longshot, deliberately gifted him with this probability altering power, aka luck power, wherein anytime Longshot tried to say do something of a noble nature, such as rescuing someone, his luck power would kick in, and regardless of how quote unquote long of a shot it was, that his plan would work or that his action would succeed, this luck power would result in him basically succeeding against all odds. But there was a side effect though, in that this luck power would work out in an ill manner for someone else. And so anytime Longshot used his power, albeit for good, someone else would end up suffering from bad luck. But if Longshot, say, tried to use his abilities selfishly, then they would backfire on him. So he was created to be the leader in a rebellion against the Spineless Ones, but he had ended up having to go on the run from some of Mojo's enforcers, including a woman named Spiral, who was a six-armed dimensional dancer. So basically, she was able to use magic that she had to literally dance in between dimensions. And so he ended up in our world, in our dimension, and had some wild adventures, and then his memory was restored to him. In some ways, he had Doctor Strange to thank for some of that. But then at the end of his miniseries, though, with his memory restored, Longshot and a couple of his friends, namely a stunt woman named Ricochet Rita and a fellow member of the Mojoverse named Cork, decided to go back to the Mojo verse, to Mojo World, to bring the idea of freedom to the masses and lead a rebellion against the spineless ones, except this time, hopefully with a chance of success. But as this particular annual shows, though, that rebellion failed on some level, and we don't know all the details, but we know that from certain dialogue that the rebellion didn't work. Because when Longshot, comes, back onto the scene, he has yet again a case of amnesia, and he ends up being an unwitting pawn of Mojo. So this particular annual, though, it has certain plot elements that stem from an annual of the New Mutants series. Namely, there was a character named Betsy Braddock, aka Psylocke, who at this point in time is a new member of the X-Men. But prior to her becoming a member of the X-Men, she was with the New Mutants for a little while, and and she had actually been brought to Xavier's school, by her brother Captain Britain, aka Brian Braddock, and she had actually been blinded in an adventure that occurred in Captain Britain's series, if I remember correctly. But in this New Mutants annual, Mojo and his forces had actually kidnapped Psylocke and experimented on her in such a way to where she now has bionic eyes, so she can see, but she's now an unwitting pawn of Mojo. And he had also gotten the New Mutants, taken to his dimension as well. But thankfully, with the actions of Cypher and Warlock, mainly with their actions, the New Mutants were able to get out of Mojo's dimension and take Betsy Braddock with them, albeit without knowing that she was an unwitting spy for Mojo. And so as this particular annual starts off, it's in the training room, or in the danger room, where the X-Men are going through a training session, and they're being put through their paces by Magneto. And Magneto at this point in time has reformed and has been given charge of Xavier's school, so he's leading both the X-Men and the New Mutants. But here, though, I mean, he's putting the X-Men through their paces while the New Mutants are watching from the observation booth. And in the meantime, though, Psylocke, though, while she's watching all this, Mojo is seeing this from his dimension. And since he had recently had a go at the New Mutants, he wants to take a shot at the big time. Namely, he wants to go after the X-Men and try and bring them under his sway. And so what he ends up doing is taking a newly amnesiac Longshot and sending him through from his dimension into our dimension, and right smack dab into the X-Men's danger room. And also this strange substance comes through with Longshot and covers all the X-Men that are gathered there in the danger room. And at first, the substance seems harmless and everything, and it shortly disappears. And after Longshot wakes up, I mean, they're asking him who he is and everything, and I mean, he remembers his name, but he doesn't really know exactly where he came from. I mean, he just has fragments of memory. And when Betsy Braddock tried to scan his mind, it was a mess, because he doesn't have like a solid idea of his identity. He doesn't know who he is, just pieces and fragments. But next morning, though, all the X-Men who had been exposed to that substance that had come through with Longshot have been turned into either teenagers or children, and so, or I should say preteens and children, and so as a result, the New Mutants end up having to step up and babysit the now ex-babies. And Longshot, unfortunately, ends up being victim to this as well, as he gradually starts to, turn into like a child, form of himself. And so, while the New Mutants are trying to figure out what's going on, they're kind of limited as to what they can do, because the computers that they would have, used, to, scan the, danger room and everything, were destroyed when Longshot, came through into our dimension. There was like a energy backlash. And so the New Mutants, Cypher and Warlock, decide to merge with one another, to see if they can maybe get a reading on some of the residue, if there was any left over. And so Cypher, just to tell y'all who Cypher is, was a mutant who had the ability to understand any language, and also speak it as well. And Warlock was a member of an alien race. I think they were called the Technicarchs, but they were sort of like this techno-organic race of beings that they were kind of like the Borg, in a sense that they assimilated you, but they turned you into this sort of biomechanical husk when they took your energy. And so Warlock, though, thankfully turns out to be a benevolent member of his race, and and he's been a loyal ally to the New Mutants in the time that he's been with them. But he's become really good friends with Cypher, and the two of them have actually merged several times throughout their series, in a sense that it gives Cypher a sense of physical protection, because Warlock is able to form like a living suit of armor around Cypher, and Cypher in turn is able to use his skills in a way that won't get him killed. But in this instance, though, the two of them, they merge together into sort of this borderline techno-organic being, in order to fully scan the room, because with Warlock having an energy source to tap from, he's able to scan the residue of the substance that came through. And Cypher basically volunteered to allow Warlock to tap from his life force in order to have enough power to be able to scan the residue, because by himself, I mean, he was able to sense that there was something there, but he can't determine exactly what it is. And basically he needs a boost in power, which is where Cypher volunteers. And so Warlock explains that the substance that he's scanning is similar to some genetic material from his own race, but it's not the same thing. And in fact, it's something that they've encountered before. And it comes from, as in the New Mutants have encountered before, and it comes from the Mojo verse. And so when they realize that Mojo's involved, they meet up with the rest of the New Mutants and tell them what's going on. And so while the New Mutants are trying to make sense of all this and come up with a some sort of plan for okay, how do we use that knowledge to get the X-Men back to their normal selves? Well, the X-Men, unfortunately, grow bored and restless and decide to go on a joyride. Except bear in mind that they're now reverted to children with the minds of children, and they have basically kind of forgotten how to drive. And so they steal a car, but go on this road trip that takes hours just to get from a couple of one block to another, that kind of thing. But they end up at this place called the Body Shop, which is actually this other dimensional facility that Mojo's henchman Spiral uses. And she uses that place to augment people, like to transform them into a changed being. And so she and Mojo are actually waiting for the X-babies, knowing that they would show up, and they hypnotize them and bring them into the place. And so when the New Mutants figure out what's going on, and and they realize that Mojo has kidnapped them. They realize that it's up to them to rescue the X-Men, and so for the occasion, they don these new costumes that had actually been made specifically for them, albeit in the event that the X-Men were either incapacitated or murdered. And so, for a brief amount of time, the New Mutants, become the X-Men to go rescue the X-Men. And of course they're thinking that they're going to be, rescuing the X-babies, only to find that, Mojo and Spiral have used their technology to turn the X-Men back into their, adult versions of themselves, albeit versions that are loyal to Mojo, and they're out for the New Mutants' blood. This includes Longshot. And so the X-Men and Longshot are going after the New Mutants, once they get onto the scene. And, the two, sides end up fighting each other. But thankfully, the New Mutants are, gradually able to, turn, the tables on the X-Men by way of, helping them to break through their brainwashing. One example being, Wolverine. They're able to, get through to him to a point where he's, tears off, the devices that were keeping him enslaved to Mojo, and he's in a feral state, and because, he doesn't, anytime, he's, taken control of mentally or brainwashed in any way, he does not react well to it. And so for a brief amount of time, he's in a kill crazy state, but then he kind of, calms back down and is back to his normal self, and he works with the New Mutants to, get the X-Men, out of Mojo's control. And so ultimately, they're able to, force Spiral to use her powers, to work with them to get the X-Men back, the rest of the X-Men back to their normal selves. But at that point, Spiral and Mojo end up appearing, like they teleport back to their home dimension, and so at the end of the day, the New Mutants were able to basically save the X-Men from themselves, but they're back to being New Mutants though, since the X-Men are now back. But this time though, they have a new member on the team, Longshot. And so Longshot, with his childlike sense of innocence and naivety, there's a lot about Earth that he doesn't understand. Like there comes a point where towards the end of the story, he's relaxing with the rest of the X-Men, and like they're having a barbecue or something, and he's looking at the pool, and he's in awe of how this strange surface is ever changing, and they're like, don't you know what water is? And so then one of them playfully pushes him in there, and he has a laugh there. So I mean, it's gonna take some getting used to for him to get accustomed to how things are on Earth, but he ends up striking up a friendship with some of the X-Men, and it looks like things might be promising for him. And also because of the fact that now that he's out of Mojo's control, his luck power could be used to benefit the team. And so in the meantime though, Mojo is still watching through the eyes of Betsy Braddock, who is still unaware of the fact that Mojo is using her to spy on the X-Men. Mojo is basically glad at how all this worked out, because I mean sure, he and Spiral ended up having to retreat, but at the end of the day though, they pushed the X-Men to a new level of survival. And he laughs and says that this only proves that they need someone like him, and he can't wait to to do something else to them or some other dastardly scheme in the future. But that was that was the essential story of X-Men Annual 10, and I thought that it was it was a fun story. I thought that it was pretty cool seeing Longshot's co-creator Arthur Adams back drawing his character. And even though Chris Claremont was the one who was writing the story, he was a good enough writer to be able to sort of tap into the sort of blank slate innocence of Longshot's character, and have his characterization be consistent from, say, his miniseries to his debut with the X-Men here. And I also liked how he developed the characters both with the X-Men and the New Mutants, because he was actually writing both New Mutants and the X-Men at this point in time. And as a result, if you were reading both series around this time, there was a sense of consistency in terms of, say, plot developments and what have you. For example, we have Cypher, sort of having a crush on Betsy Braddock, and that sort of carries over into this issue, for example. And of course, they refer to the events in that annual where her eyes were experimented on and changed, and she's still sort of reeling from the trauma of that. And of course, she's an unknowing pawn too. And there was some references to Longshot's own miniseries, wherein we find out that the attempted rebellion that Longshot and his friends tried to lead failed, although we don't exactly know all the details of that. They're kind of vague in that regard. I did think it was pretty funny to see the X-Men reduced to child versions of themselves and basically acting like little kids, and bickering and arguing and stuff that little kids would do. And so having the New Mutants, who are all teenagers at this point, having to be the adults in the room, whereas usually it's the other way around, was actually pretty funny. And some of the dialogue and banter between the teams because of that are frankly some of the funniest moments in the X-Men series, as far as the material I've read. But I also thought it was pretty cool, even prior to them being transformed into kids, and prior to Longshot coming through, it was pretty neat to see Magneto making a genuine effort to be a team leader for the X-Men, because at this point in time he's trying to prove that he's a reformed man. And since Professor X with his semi-dying wish asked Magneto to take care of the school and basically lead both the X-Men and the New Mutants. I mean, Magneto is genuinely making an effort, and so when he's putting them through their paces, he's doing so as a teacher, but he's also tapping into some of the hostility between himself and the X-Men. Like, he's tapping into the fact that the X-Men mainly remember him as a foe of theirs, and so he's kind of using that to keep them on their toes, and yet he's also there, and yet they're also having to bear in mind that that's something that he's using to his advantage. And so they're having to remember that, like, we have to treat the situation seriously, but we also have to remember that he's our teacher now, so we have to respect him in that regard. So I thought that it was an interesting dynamic that we caught a glimpse of, and we've seen more of it in issues prior to this one, as in when Magneto came on board. But it was nice to see that sort of consistency carried on. So even though that's not the main focus of the book, I thought it was nice to see that still present. And I thought that having the New Mutants share the spotlight with the X-Men, and in fact, have the spotlight for a significant portion of the X-Men's own book, was a nice little twist. And I like the idea that, Professor X and the X-Men had been aware of the fact that the New Mutants, were being trained, to, replace the X-Men should something happen to them. And so while it's a sort of, grim moment in the sense that, they're aware that there's a possibility that the X-Men could, be, dead at this point, it was pretty cool to see the New Mutants, step into the role of the X-Men, however, briefly. But I will say that the only things I could think of that that could have been improved were, say, one, the details on the failed rebellion that Longshot had led were very vague, if there at all. And so all we know is that the rebellion didn't work, and Longshot's friends are being held prisoners somewhere, presumably on Mojo World. But considering that his miniseries ended with him regaining his memory, and going back to Mojo World with the express purpose of leading a rebellion, and considering that the friends who went back with him, had become characters that we cared about by the end of his miniseries. The fact that they don't really even show up and they're just vaguely referred to, I was that was something that I thought could have been handled a little bit better, in the sense that there could have been some more detailed description as to exactly what happened. How did the rebellion fail? Or like there could have been a flashback or something. Like there could have been a moment where either Mojo or Spiral are talking about it, or there could have been a moment where Psylocke tried to read Longshot's mind and got from the fragments of memory flashes of this failed rebellion for the readers to see. But yeah, I just I wish we could have seen more of that, or have gotten a more exact explanation as to what happened. Like, where are his friends now? And we sort of find out eventually, but that's in stories outside of this issue. And also, there is a little bit of confusion as to when the story is supposed to take place, at least for me, because Shadowcat is shown to be with the X-Men at this point, Kitty Pryde, and she is indeed one of the X-Men who's turned into a child. But at the time that this annual came out, though, it had been right after the Mutant Massacre storyline, which was arguably the darkest chapter in the X-Men series up to this point. But it had been made very clear that she was a casualty of the Marauders. Namely, she had been stuck in her intangible state, and she was basically breaking down on a cellular level to a point where, she was becoming a ghost that was eventually just going to fade away. And there was a bit of a cliffhanger, in regards to, her character, as well as the characters of Nightcrawler and Colossus, because they too were casualties of the Marauders. And so, considering, there was that, cliffhanger, element to, her, fate at the end of the Mutant Massacre, and, the fact that, they're trying to find some way to, reverse the process and get her back to, where she's able to turn tangible, once more. But they weren't having any luck last time we saw. It was kind of confusing, suddenly, seeing her, hale and hearty with, the X-Men. And while it was funny, having her, basically, mouthing off and acting like a little baby because she'd been turned into a little, a baby more or less. Or a child. I mean, it was funny to see her in that regard, but it was also just kind of confusing because you go from, her, being in a very dangerous, situation in a sense that she's gradually, turning into a ghost, and that was going to vanish altogether, and which was definitely not a laughing matter. And then it goes to, this story where it is a laughing matter because, I mean, there's no, trace of that. So I just think that in terms of chronology, they could have done a better job of maybe saying exactly when the story was supposed to take place. And so it's not a bad story. It's just that, you know, it's confusing to go from, the end of the mutant massacre to this story, and suddenly, she's fine. You're like, wait, what? So, but I'm going to go ahead and give that particular, story, X-Men Annual 10, I'm going to go ahead and give it, 4 out of 5 stars. It was a fun story, and, it was neat to see, Longshot, a character I very much enjoyed in his own miniseries, being brought onto the team here. And, it was really cool seeing, Arthur Adams', detailed artwork, because he's someone who influenced people like, Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld in terms of, say, art style. But so it was cool, seeing him, come to the X-Men and involved in a story, with the Mojo verse, which is, something that he co-created with Anna Cinti. So even though there isn't a whole lot of focus on Longshot, but there's a lot of focus on, say, Mojo and Spiral, and so it was neat seeing Arthur Adams, coming back to draw, characters and places that he had co-created. And it's always a treat when we see him draw the X-Men as well. And the artwork he did for the Asgardian saga, for example, it was like a 2-part saga between the X-Men and the New Mutants, was, amazing. So anytime you see him working with the X-Men, you're in for a treat. And it was funny to see, the X-Men, reduced to childlike versions of themselves, and, some of the comedy that ensued there. And I especially liked the fact that, it took them hours to go from one distance to another, like a very short distance, because they all forgot how to drive, But yeah, I'll go ahead and give it, 4 out of 5 stars. So since we have a little bit of time, I'll show y'all some of the artwork. So I already showed y'all the cover here, but the story opens up and it's in the danger room. That's Magneto right there. And there's Betsy Braddock right there. Psylocke. And here we go. Then we head into the Mojo verse, where Mojo and his people are spying, through Betsy Braddock's eyes. There's Mojo right there. Right there. The Spiral. But I've always liked how, he was able to, on one hand, draw a hideous being like, Mojo, or Arthur Adams was, but then when it came to, say, drawing, someone like, Spiral, there's, like, this strange, sense of beauty to her character. This is where Longshot ends up, being sent through. Close up on his face there. And so this is where, the X-Men all find themselves turned into kids. And there's Kitty Pryde right there, freaking out. So we got the New Mutants right here, X-Babies there. You know, trying to figure out what's going on. And of course, all the X ladies are fangirling over Longshot there, the hospital bed. And here's where we get, you know, Warlock and Cypher, you know, merging to be able to fully scan the area. Here we go. Love the detail in this picture right here. That's when Cypher and Warlock have fully merged to be able to scan all that stuff. But Arthur Adams, you know, when it came to drawing like Warlock and like the techno-organic stuff, you know, he was great at it. But and here they've devolved even further into, you know, children, literally, including Longshot. But if you look at like the faces right here, this is where they end up at the body shop. But if you look at the faces, like the grins, like on them and on Mojo, I mean, that type of grin that Arthur Adams originated, you know, it's been used by artists such as Rob Liefeld and Todd McFarlane. So, you know, you can definitely see, you know, an influence there. But, and here's where the New Mutants are looking through the chest to, you know, get the costumes that were meant for them when they stepped into the X-Men's place. And that's Cypher, you know, without all the techno-organic stuff. But here we go. Meet the new X-Men. I actually thought the costumes were pretty cool. And, you know, while I understand why they, you know, returned the costumes, you know, to the chest where they got them from at the end of the story, because, you know, the X-Men are back, you know, I would have liked to have seen them, you know, in these costumes in further adventures, because, I mean, not only are they cool costumes and the New Mutants look good in them, but I think that the New Mutants proved that they had what it took to basically step up and replace the X-Men if need be with this adventure. So, oh, here we go. Cool shot of Spiral right there. But it's when they're fighting each other, you know, the X-Men under Mojo's control and, you know, fighting against the New Mutants. But another gruesome shot of Mojo right there. Also, I love the detail on this part right here with Spiral and the rain. Because Mojo, I mean, in Arthur Adams' hands, you know, goes from being someone who's comedic to just downright terrifying. And this is when, you know, they're able to, you know, get Wolverine to fight through the brainwashing. And once again, you know, we have, you know, facial expression, you know, that would be very influential with, you know, other artists down the road. But here's Storm right here. And one of the ironic things is that, you know, with Mojo and Spiral's tampering, you know, Storm temporarily, you know, was given control of, her powers once more, because her powers had been taken from her. But with their tampering, she briefly got them back. But of course, when the X-Men broke through the brainwashing and fought back against Mojo, her powers were taken from her once more. And here's a bit where Rogue, tries to absorb some of Mojo's energy, to weaken him, but while she distracts him, she ends up going through like this grotesque transformation. So some good body horror artwork. A nice shot of Spiral there, doing her dimensional dancing. And so, after the adventure's over, the New Mutants are returning the stuff to the chest. And I like how, with Warlock, Arthur Adams was able to make someone as bizarre looking as him have a very human-like expression on his face, something sad. And here they are, just chilling out, by the pool, having a barbecue, and there's Longshot right there, marveling at the water before being pushed in. But yeah, and the way the story ends, of course, you have it being a smash hit with the spineless ones. So, but yeah, that was X-Men Annual 10. And the story was called Performance. So, but yeah, it was a good story. It was a nice, first chapter in this particular volume. And, in a way, issues with chronology aside, I thought it was a nice, fun break from the darkness of the Mutant Massacre. And, to be fair, most of the stories in this volume outside of Annual 10 are right off the heel of, Mutant Massacre. And so, it's a pretty, dark set of stories that we get. So it was nice to see, a story that sort of, took a break from things and had some fun, So, but yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. And if you have any thoughts in regards to, my new, attempt at a different format, by way of, say, reviewing parts of, the book instead of like the whole thing, which I intend to review the whole thing, but in sections, though, as I said in my previous video. So if you got any thoughts on that, just let me know. I'm open to input. But thank you very much for taking the time to check us out. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care. Bye.